that beautiful voice. Just a beautiful, beautiful voice. So that really does kind of invite us into the Celtic way this night, does it not? And just a quick recap of last week for those of you who couldn't be with us. Is really the journey in the Celtic way is coming to appreciate that which we have inherited from the Celtic Christian experience. I realized last week I just used the word Celtic Christian experience particularly. And just quickly to remind you of the major points of last week is to remind you that in that periphery of the world of the Christian experience, in those remote places we know today as Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and you all know that throughout history the border of Wales moved back and forth depending on kingdoms and pursuit of lands, right? But we're talking about a part of the world where the Roman imperial experience of the Christian church did not reach. The Roman experience, in fact, never reached Ireland. What that meant was that a Christianity was born in that part of the world that was different from the part of the world that was settled by the Roman Empire. And with it would have come the Latinized systems of territory, diocese, the rites, the rituals, the hierarchy, the organization of that experience. Instead, in rural lands, it was also very rural as opposed to an urban experience of the Roman existence. Instead, in rural lands, Christianity found a people wed to the land, and wed to an understanding and appreciation of all of creation. A strong indigenous society and culture that Esther Duvall describes as heroic and tribal, with a long tradition of native learning. That incorporated without shame, she says, incorporated their pagan and secular experiences as Christianity came to them, without shame. Right? Without shame. And that's not to be understated, I don't think. I think that's an important piece that indigenous folk very easily were able to incorporate what they knew and who they were. So the example I used this morning was, so they were still able to rally themselves around those large rock formations and walk around in a circle and find Christ there. Even though for generations they were walking around those circles, finding other things there, they easily incorporated that piece of their existence and found Christ there. Without shame, which is playing off the imperial piece of this is how we do it. This is how you will do it. Right? You get that piece. Okay. It's important. I mentioned last week, and I practiced this week. I mentioned last week that in these tribal... Oh, this is really hard for me. No. That's okay. I mentioned that in these rural tribal areas, folks of the land would gather, and that the organization was that they would gather in small fortified areas. You can't even call them villages because they really weren't even villages, but small fortified areas where families would have dwellings, where they would work the land. And in Wales, these were called llans. I've been practicing this all week. They're called llans. That's how you say it. I learned how to say it. Llans. Llans. Yeah, right? And so these llans in Wales, these fortified tribal areas, would easily become places where the monastic pilgrims coming from Ireland would find an easy place and a welcome place, because in the Celtic way, you welcome the stranger. They would find this an easy, built-in system, so to speak, where they would sit, bring the word of Christ, and eventually build a little church or a monastery. And then over time, this would become the existence in that land. Clans. These places, these fortified small communities, would make easy transitions for Christian monks, and they would easily find themselves organized, some of them, into monastic communities where a choosing of an abbot would indeed be one who would oversee this general area and the spiritual life. In that monasticism began to grow up in these small clans, codes of behavior would begin to develop. What we would know today as a rule, in monastic life, codes of behavior. But these places would become places of spirit, they would become places of well-being, and they would become places of care. All of which building on the indigenous people who were there, and building upon their worldview. And just quickly to remind you, the Celtic way, the Celtic worldview, there's an unfolding of the common, the everyday experience, into a spirit of nurture and spiritual devotion. There was an enmeshing of the material world into their spiritual disciplines and into their everyday activities. And if you either listened to YouTube or you were here last week, you remember that little excerpt that I read from Esther about the mountain woman lighting her fire, damping her fire at night, and then lighting it in the morning, and finding in that everyday ritual the opportunity to find the divine in it. And you will remember, God bless you, whoever just sneezed, you will remember that in the Celtic experience, and particularly in the monastic way, there was a strong influence from the Eastern Desert Fathers, who in the 2nd century found themselves in the deserts of Egypt, forming themselves as hermits, and beginning an ascetical life, which was an interior, prayerful existence. So Celtic spirituality has this wonderful enmeshing of an appreciation and an embracing of all that is around them, and seeing that as a landscape also, or a metaphor, for the interior spiritual life, right? The short little video I showed last week from John O'Donohue, the 5 points that he made about the Celtic way, which I remind you of tonight. Okay, so sorry about that. Okay, this is week 3 of our Bardsey journey, and the first 2 weeks we have spent first just kind of setting and inviting ourselves into the Celtic worldview. Last week we spoke about the Celtic saints and the spirit of peregrinatio, that is pilgrimage. And tonight, going forward, we're going to shift a little bit. If you remember way back when you looked at a brochure about this initiative, you will remember that part of what the brochure talked about was living with the Celtic saints, living in the Celtic view, living in the Celtic way, living into the rhythms of the Celtic experience, and gaining wisdom from the Celtic saints, and reflecting on those churchy words, those theological words, such things like incarnation, salvation, redemption, creation. Well, tonight we're going to reflect a little bit on incarnation. Seems appropriate as we journey these last few days of Advent toward the feast of the Incarnation. So tonight I want to particularly, I'll be using Esther Duvall's book called Living on the Border. Some of you asked me for bibliography type things. I have that for you. I'll pass that out. And that bibliography will grow over time. But this is Esther Duvall's work called Living on the Border, Reflections on the Experience of Threshold. And I want to use Esther's work tonight to try to introduce us into the concept or the experience of thresholds and develop a metaphor for us to be invited maybe perhaps into the mystery of incarnation. If you remember from the little blurby piece in your brochure, I talk about incarnation with this question: what makes your heart flutter? What makes your heart beat? You'll see where that's going at the end. Okay. So let me set the stage for tonight, and I want to do a little less talking tonight and let you do a little more talking, particularly in your small groups. We'll see how that goes. And I chose, therefore, not to have any audio-visual aids tonight. So if you need any audio-visual aids, I'll try to make faces. Okay? So Esther, in her book, Living on the Border, uses her experience of literally living on the border of England and Wales. She literally, physically, geographically lives on the border of England and Wales. You can hop in your car with a functioning GPS, and you can make your way back and forth into Wales and back into England, into Wales, back into... In fact, that's what I did daily, just about. She talks about living on the border and sets it as a metaphor, particularly as she reaches close to 80 years old, particularly on her observations of the world as she knows it and the society in which she lives. And particularly, she kind of names the obvious for all of us. We live in fast-changing times. We live in times where things change dramatically, daily. She talks about her own observations in her own work and writings and her lecturing of many folk living in the tension and with anxiety, living, as she will call it, on metaphorical borders. And she talks about the borderland as that place where where two worlds come together. I think there's more than two worlds, but she says two. So where two worlds come together, or where two worlds meet. And she uses that metaphor, living on the border, as whenever two worlds meet, there's always a threshold. There's always a place where one pauses and where one moves out and moves back, or moves out and maybe moves elsewhere. But, the back and forth, the back and forth. She kind of captures that imagery of threshold, and I want to introduce, because it's Advent and it makes perfect sense, I want to introduce that all of us, when we ponder it and we think about it, all of us have worlds that come together, and worlds meet, and all of us are going back and forth, right? That's true of life, yes? Infancy to childhood. We cross over a threshold. Out of the womb into the life, we cross through a threshold. Adolescence, God help us. Adolescence into adulthood, we cross thresholds, do we not? Young adulthood to more mature adulthood, we're crossing thresholds. Marriage or partnerships, we're crossing thresholds. If we dare, parenting, we're crossing thresholds. You get the idea. We're always having worlds meet, right? Always. And we're always crossing thresholds. Esther uses the metaphor of living on the border, and she talks about the anxiety that lives in threshold. And she ponders and asks these questions. How can life on a border be nothing other than restless? How can it be nothing other than restless? How do I hold all of this together? How do I make this living on the border a creative encounter? How do I stop myself from being pulled in one direction or the other? She talks about the moment of crossing over from one world to the next, that there is always the pause between. And she suggests, of course, that this is the place where we find the deepest exploration, particularly in our spiritual lives, right? I'm cued into John O'Donohue's quick throwaway line that I mentioned last week that I like so much, that so much of our spirituality is psychology in disguise. And we're taught, some of us rightly or wrongly, if we delve too much into the world of Rabbi Friedman, we're taught about anxiety. Well, Esther kind of liberates us from that, because living on the border, can there be nothing else but anxiety? Of course there's anxiety. Of course there is. And I'm reminded of our story, our biblical story on Sunday, of Mary and Joseph and an angel visiting. Talk about a threshold. Talk about a border from one world into another. Talk about anxiety. Talk about anxiousness. Perhaps it is the way of being. Perhaps. Right? Okay. So we're going to hang on to the image of the borderland, and particularly now we're going to live again into Esther's world, which is the Celtic world, and talk about the ancient Celts and how they lived with this understanding of threshold and borderland. In the rhythm of the day, we read a bit about this on our first time together, I think. In the rhythm of the day in the ancient Celts, tied again to their experience in the land, tied into those passages, even in the pattern of a day, the darkness of the night passing in to the hue of the morning glow as the sun rises, crossing of one threshold into another. This morning, did you see the sky this morning? Did anybody see the sky this morning, right? Yeah. Had one of those moments up early taking Bella to orchestra. And jumped in the car, and I was up early drinking my coffee. It was still dark. Came outside with Bella, got in the car, looked up, and there was that sky, right? Beautiful. Moon was full. Just feathers of pink, just perfectly painted around it. Right? Isn't that beautiful? Yeah. Crossing from one threshold of in the darkness with my coffee, my computer, out into the light with my daughter and the sky. And what did I do? That's right, I stopped the car and tried to take a picture of it. And what did I do? I couldn't do it, right? So I pulled up to the stop sign, and then I tried again, but guess what? The picture had changed. Yes, right? And I looked at Bella and I said, well, you know what Esther would say. I suppose I wasn't to possess it. And Bella said, you really miss her, don't you? I said, well, I do, but that was not my point. But you get the idea. The pattern of the day in the Celtic world was very, very important. And you remember from the first night I read you that prayerful mantra of the woman in the Hebrides who dampened the peat at night, said her prayers as she dampened it, welcomed the darkness, and then again in the morning stoked the fire and welcomed the light and found that opportunity, the opportunity to give thanks and praise for what is offered. And the day goes. We know the day goes. By midday, the sun is bright and tall, hopefully. I love, particularly, I love the seasons. We're fortunate that we have seasons where we live geographically, right? Love the seasons. I love the afternoon light. I love to watch the afternoon light change. I think it's mystical and magical from season to season. It's just transforming, really. So the ancient Celt would very much live into that pattern, crossing from threshold to threshold, taking a pregnant pause and giving thanks, saying prayer, being mindful of the holy. Their lives were shaped. Their lives were literally shaped by the patterns of the day, the patterns of light and darkness, darkness and light. Rhythms of the season were also part of the ancient Celtic understanding. Some of you may know this. Are any of you familiar with the ancient Celtic seasons? Well, good. I'll tell you about them then. In the ancient Celtic cycle, in the pagan experience, and as we talk, we'll come to an awareness of how this got assimilated into the Christian Celtic experience. The beginning of the year was November the 1st. The season of Samhain. This is the beautiful part I'm going to read. I'm going to read Esther's words because I don't want to butcher it. The season of Samhain was the beginning of the year, November the 1st. Esther says that the country folk that live near here still talk about the turning of the year in the beginning of November. This is the time of year in the ancient Celtic experience that is the thinnest time of the year. This is the time at which the veil between time and eternity can easily become transparent. The time in which the veil between time and eternity can easily become transparent. This is the time in which the shadows, of course, would lengthen. The folks who were herding their cattle and sheep would drive them down from the hills and into the winter's safe keeping. And they would light fires at night with all that was dying. That would be limbs and branches and carcass. Literally lighting light into the night. Right? So in the Christian experience, what do we know of November the 1st?
All Saints Day.
All Saints Day. You see that easy relationship. Where in our celebration of All Saints Day, we too believe that it's the thinnest of veils that separate time and eternity, separate the living and the dead. Samhain was the invitation to winter, and the rituals of the ancient Celts were tied to it. Spring comes with the feast of Imbolc, Imbolc, and that comes, when do you think that comes? February the 1st. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? February the 1st. And this is when the ancient Celts believed that the threshold to new life would beckon. This was the season in which the ewes would begin to lactate. New growth would begin to show its potential in the soil, or show its pregnancy of potential. Just remember, it doesn't snow as much there. The days begin to grow longer, and the sun begins to shine new light. Hear a poem, an ancient poem. We breathe new air, no longer cold with seeming death. The flowers respond to the strengthening sun, your light. So may your hearts respond to your love and grace. The birds break into song and call us to your praise. So may our hearts give praise at all aspects of our lives. the frozen earth and water melt to new life. So may our hardened hearts be softened to gentleness and love. We are overwhelmed with images, symbols, confirmations of your resurrecting, your enlivening. This in the season of Imbolc. Remember last week, by the way, we were talking about the Celtic date of Easter. I sent out a link for you all, right? It's usually late April or May. But clearly, this is the season of the thaw for the ancient Celts. And I'm guessing if you're living in a cold, dark, desolate place, the sooner the spring comes, the better. Right? February the 1st is also what feast day? Anybody know? I knew you would know. It is the feast of St. Bridget. Yes, the feast of St. Bridget, who I promised I would talk about just a little bit today, right? So the feast of St. Bridget. Interesting thing about Bridget, and Rick knows well, Bridget. St. Bridget was seen by the pagan Celts as a fertility goddess. She was very much, after her conversion, a Christian. And she was a great abbess, establishing the community at Kildare, where we once had a partner relationship with here in the Diocese of Bethlehem with the Diocese of Meath and Kildare. One of the great, Bridget was known as the patron saint of many things, but she was also known as Mary Gael. She was known as Mary Gael. She was the patron saint of motherhood. She was a great evangelist. It is said that she went out into her little chariot. Every time you say chariot, you think of Moses and all that. I'm sure the Celtic chariot was different than that. Out into her chariot and carried out the great words of evangelism to the countryside in Ireland. And it is said that she was a great champion for the poor, for the just, and it is even said in the legend of Bridget that she brought sight to the blind, hope to the poor, etc., freed prisoners, all that Isaiah stuff that we read and talk about the coming Messiah. The other interesting tidbit, throwaway line, is that Bridget also clearly was revered by the ancient Celtic Christians and historians, because even the skeptical Welsh historians, always skeptical of their Irish counterparts, even the historians of Wales wrote glowingly of Bridget. And it is even said that on a particular day and in a particular place, when two bishops had come to the community there in Kildare, that one of the bishops mistakenly read Bridget's name during a prayer of consecration, and that she indeed was made bishop. The Welsh historian, writing about such, refused to refute that information. And so it goes. And so it goes. Oh, I'll read you a quote from Bridget later. Okay. May the 1st would be the next seasonal shift, the next threshold, and this would be the invitation of summer. The invitation of the summer feast of Beltane. Light has overtaken the darkness, the ancient Celts would celebrate. Flocks would be taken from their winter quarters up to the high hills, once again to graze and to fatten in the meadows. This would be the season of growth and fulfillment. Growth and fulfillment. In our own cycle, liturgical cycle now in the Christian church, particularly, we call that season of growing Pentecost. And we don the liturgical green, do we not? In real life, we know that our summers don't really start May the 1st. We know that. But in the Celtic calendar, they do. August the 1st, finally, is the Feast of Lammas, the beginning of the harvest, when the earth brings forth its first fruits to birth. This is the Celtic cycle and rhythm, threshold to threshold, lightness and darkness, the cycle of life, death and winter, to new life and fruit. Esther writes in her book about how she has tried to keep the Celtic calendar, and that how difficult that is for us, and it's true for us too in the West, because clearly our calendar is a different calendar. We are on the consumer/education calendar, are we not? Right? And where the first fruits would be coming in the Celtic world in August, I'd like to believe and hang on to the fact that I too go and claim those last little bits of corn from the farmer down the road in August, right? Those first fruits. In the Orthodox Church, on the Feast of the Transfiguration in early August, there is a celebration in their liturgy which ends with the blessing of the first fruits. So living into that Celtic, the day pattern, and in the yearly pattern, you can see that built in there are thresholds. Thresholds crossed and crossed again. Crossed and crossed again. And so tonight, we ponder the threshold of what I call incarnation. And on this fourth Sunday of Advent, invite us to look at the outer landscape of the worlds that we see, the borderlands that we live in our lives, and ponder the inner landscape of that. Pope Leo, writing in the 5th century, wrote this on Christmas Day: "O man and woman, rouse yourself. Learn to know the dignity of your nature. Use this visible creation as it should be used, as you use the earth and sea and sky and air and springs and rivers and whatever is beautiful and wonderful, in them acknowledging the praise and glory of God. Touch the physical light with the bodily sense and embrace with all the power of your soul the true light." Touch the physical light with the bodily sense and embrace with all the power of your soul the true light. Can you hear the incarnation? Can you hear the incarnational theology in that? Touch it, taste it, embrace it, feel it, right? Flesh, fleshy. Here's a quote from St. Bridget, only because I said I would quote her. St. Bridget said, "I would like the angels of heaven to be among us. I would like an abundance of peace. I would like full vessels of charity. I would like rich treasures of mercy. I would like cheerfulness to preside over all. I would like Jesus to be present. I would like all of the Marys of illustrious renown to be with us. I would like the friends of heaven to be gathered around us from all parts. I would like myself to be a rent prayer to the Lord, that I should suffer distress, and that he should bestow a good blessing upon me." And here's my favorite part, the most incarnational part. "I would like a great lake of beer for the King of Kings. I would like to be watching heaven's family drinking it throughout all eternity." Isn't that fabulous?
Famous attribute. It sounds like we have our Bardsey t-shirt. I would like a great lake of beer.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, that will be a point of departure when we head off into Wales. We'll be looking for that great lake of beer. Hear these words. I hope you hear them as familiar. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. all things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. Sound familiar? The Word becomes flesh. Not one thing comes into being except through him. And what has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. So, if we think about borderlands, and if we think about threshold as a metaphor for us, perhaps tonight we take a pregnant pause. I was waiting for that line, Mickey. Perhaps tonight we take a pregnant pause. I'm going to share a story with you. And this, I think, I hope you hear in this reflection that threshold of incarnation, the invitation to the Word becoming flesh. I've been given permission to tell this story, just so you know. And some of you know Jeannie Eric. Jeannie Eric is a parishioner here, has been for many, many years. If you don't know Jeannie Eric, you should know Jeannie Eric. She's delightful and lovely. Some of you may know the story that in the early 1990s, that her daughter, Julianne, who was living in Florida as a young adult and waitressing at a local restaurant, was murdered by a gentleman with a mental health issue, off his medication, who walked into the restaurant where she was working and shot her. This happened in the early 1990s. Fast forward to 2013, and remembering what we say about November the 1st, All Saints' Day 2013, in this cathedral, we baptized a little girl named Julianne. This was Jeannie's great-granddaughter, Julianne, named after her daughter, Julianne. Jeannie's given me permission, and this is the reflection that I wrote about that experience. And this is called Julianne's Breath. I can't even see her face, really. I don't remember the look of it. One, because I really never knew her, though I can only imagine her through the eyes and beauty of her mother. That would be Jeannie. Those eyes mixed always with the beauty of joy that is her mother, and the pain that we know of her grief-filled loss. I remember well the pain and suffering of that tragic circumstance when one who was loved so dearly was lost. I remember well that grief-filled heart so diligently, so lovingly, so courageously, holding on to the Word that enfleshed itself deep, somewhere deep in her being, a Word that shone like a light in a deep darkness of despair, a Word that her being knew was a threshold to be crossed. Forgiveness, a new path, a path to some liberation from pain and anger, though its bitter seed, too familiar, a companion. Now, how can it be? How can it be that the rhythm of life, of darkness and light, of seasons passing, of winter's darkness and summer's light, of autumn's bronzing and spring's new life, of All Saints' Samhain, would bring us a grace unexpected or unexplained? The thinnest veil, they say, that time at which the veil between time and eternity can easily become transparent. So transparent that there she was, Love, that is. Life, that is. A generation that is living forward. New life. A babe in the flesh, full of beauty, warm to the touch, soft and vulnerable, loved and loving. A word, if you will, made flesh. The word is beauty, hope, birth, and life. A word mixed with the reality of life and the bitterness sometimes tasted. A word carried in her name, the name she carries of the one loved and lost. Suddenly, quietly, a narrative of heart quickens in beat of a humbled priest. A narrative no one knows or can be aware of, but perhaps in the quiet of their own being. A soft babe breathes the breath of sleep, and the waters of eternity touch her soft, warm head. We pause, a pregnant pause, for the briefest of moments, as my heart fills with the presence of the one named Julian, who was taken from this family, this good, loving family. And there is the threshold. We're about to cross this threshold, and today, it's a quick journey. The veil between time and eternity, the living and the dead, the darkness and the light, the Word made flesh. I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. The cold water shakes this beauty to life. Her breath quickens. Her body begins to stir and to squirm. Her eyes open with beauty and with terror. And we exchange a truth unspoken, a word, if you will. She and I and all the saints and angels, though all those assembled there that day. Julian, you are marked as Christ's own forever. Her heart quick, my heart quick. Word becomes flesh. Eternity, indeed eternity. Eternity in the breath of Julian. Eternity for her. Eternity for the one whose name she carries as her own. So, two things about that. One thing is this is like a really courageous congregation. There are so many stories, kind of like that one, but not exactly. And sometimes you tell them to each other, and sometimes you don't. But there's so many stories to be shared of courage and hope and light and life and word becoming flesh. That's a whole sidelight. That's not really what I wanted to say at all. But it's true. It's true. But your job on this journey now is to ponder the threshold of incarnation, those places where lightness and darkness and word and flesh come together, those worlds. See this as a metaphor for life. So whether you're moving from infancy to childhood, from childhood to adulthood, from young adulthood to more mature adulthood, from student to professional, from single to married or partnered, from parent to empty nester, from vocation to vocation. What word is pregnant to be born and fleshed? What makes your heart beat quicker? What makes it flutter? How does your breath move in and out of your lungs in a way that makes you feel alive and new? What feels right? I'm going to hand to you 2 pieces of paper. Anybody we actually have 3 minutes before I send you into small groups. Anybody have any comments or concerns or...
What's the temperature like in Bardsey? I mean, are there seasons as severe as ours or not?
They don't get nearly as much snow because it's a little warmer by current,
No, I just was
I
wondering.
think you're about a month ahead in winter time, winter and spring.
Yeah. Yeah. I was there in May. It was chilly, but not cold. And I'll just seize that moment to tell you a quick story because I have time. So, because everything is about threshold and pattern in the Celtic way, one of the things that Esther had me do, and at first I thought she was playing a game with me, but then I realized this was a spiritual discipline. There was a big festival that happens every May on the Wye River. Some of you may have heard or read about it. It's a great festival. Music, literary festival. Speakers from all over the world, from all disciplines, come and speak. And I got very excited because someone tipped me off that I was going to be there when this was happening, and I was all ready to go. And Esther said, well, maybe we'll go at the end of the week. And then Esther decided that wasn't a good idea for me to go, that she was going to go. But if I didn't mind, would I mind staying back and raking her yard? This is a true story.
Wax on, wax off.
And I thought, wow, I'm the youngest of 4 boys, and boy, did it feel like it that day. I was like, okay, so, and what are you going to say? I mean, the woman put me up for many days, and she fed me, and there I was. So what was I going to say? No. And so I stayed, and I stayed home. She went to the thing, and I stayed home. And I started to rake her yard, and she showed me where the rake was and all that stuff. And so I went out and started to rake the yard, but as is the case in that part of the world, it was sprinkling. And so I had to work through my resentment. So at first I was resentful. I was like, oh, my God, I make my kids do this at home, But it was really interesting because there was a pattern that developed, and it was just through the climate and the rain of the day. And I settled into, I would go outside, I'd rake a little bit, it'd start raining heavily, and I would go back inside, and I would journal. And I'd wait for the rain to stop, and then I'd go back outside, and I'd rake a little more, and it would start raining again. And I'd go back inside, and I would journal. And so it literally took me all day to rake her yard. Her yard's not big. It took me all day, just through the rain, through the, right, of that rhythm. So, clearly she was doing a discipline with me. She also got her yard raked. I understand that. I do. But I think that's just it. The climate, the cycle of the day, the pattern of the day, particularly in the agrarian piece of that world. It's much different than the world we live, right? It doesn't matter if it's raining or snowing or whatever. I still got my computer. Well, I can still be productive, right? I can still write prayers or write a sermon or send emails to poor Tom Kolib and drive him crazy.
Did you journal about resenting missing the festival?
I did. Of course I did. Yes. Right. It was part of this great spiritual discipline, right? But I didn't miss anything. Bless you. Whoever sneezed. Yeah. But at the end of the day, my resentment, really, and even the physical nature, the physicality of just being out there was nice. I mean, did I mention I sent my kids out to do that? So, it was just nice.
And the threshold you crossed was from where to where?
That's a great question. The threshold I crossed was perhaps from, I don't know. I'll have to think about that. I'll have to go read what I journaled. That's really what I have to do. Yeah. Okay. Yes?
How long were you with her?
I was with her for a week. a week. The most challenging part was the night she served herring for dinner, cold. That's when every bit of my mother's compassionate heart that says, "Don't ever embarrass me," came through. Anyway, I'm just kidding. No, I'm just kidding.